Welcome to Inhale, Exhale, Elevate. I am Autumn Shelton. Today's guest is Leah Maurer. Leah is a community organizer and activist who lives in Portland, Oregon with her family of 5. She has operated in the cannabis sector since 2014 and is one of the owners of The Weed Blog, one of the top cannabis news and information publications. She also does freelance journalism and consulting in the cannabis industry. Leah has co-founded grassroots advocacy groups who help change cannabis policy in both Oregon and Missouri, including a group called Moms for Yes on Measure 91, which proved to be a pivotal in legalizing adult use cannabis in Oregon. She is a founding member of the Oregon Equity Investment PAC, which passed legislation to establish the Equity Investment Act in spring of 2022. She's also a newly appointed board member for the Cannabis Policy Oversight Team for the City of Portland. Leah values community building, social justice, and civic engagement, and it shows through her volunteer service and work endeavors. Welcome to Inhale, Exhale, Elevate podcast. I am Autumn Shelton. This is a podcast hosted from our Santa Barbara Coast family cannabis farm to help keep your feet on the ground and your head in the sky. Autumn Brands and our female founders have a message that goes beyond just flowers. Learn about how our 2 families created a booming cannabis company that is leading the industry towards cleaner and more sustainable cannabis production. We aspire to move beyond strictly cannabis to help plant medicine lose the stoner stigma as we talk about all things holistic health. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you so much, Autumn. Thanks for having me on.
I'm excited for today.
Me too.
So let's dive in. What inspired you to become an advocate for this industry and dive into a profession of being a canna journalist?
Yeah, there's kind of multiple things, and I think we'll touch on those throughout the course of the interview. But when I sort of fast forward to, like, as you were saying, I've been in the sector since 2014. It really all started with advocacy. It all started with activism around policy change from experiences I'd had myself, but also finding out so many things about the criminalization of cannabis and how so many social injustices were intertwined with the criminalization of cannabis and the overall drug war. So really kind of looking at it from cannabis being like a big piece of that need for reform with the overall drug war and everything that was intertwined with that. And that all kind of came around, my family and I moved to Portland, Oregon in 2009. We watched 2 legalization measures fail here, one in 2010 and one in 2012. And in 2013 was really when my partner Travis and I decided to let's really try and do more with this. We had our footing a little bit better. We had our 3rd child here and things had kind of settled a little bit from, having an infant. And we really, felt strongly about driving forward from a very much like an advocate and activist standpoint. And it was during that time that we kind of pulled this sort of like Genesis meeting of the people who ended up rolling out Measure 91 in 2014, which is what successfully legalized cannabis here in Oregon at that time.
Can you go into a little more detail about that measure?
Yeah. It was, there were several things that were different about that measure than the 2 that we had seen fail in many different ways. And a big part of it was that there was a bigger coalition of people. And it wasn't just the activists this time. It was establishment attorneys. It was politicians. It was national funders that were willing to say, no, Oregon's ready for this. And we don't need to wait for the next presidential election, which would have been in 2016. And as you may know, there were several other states that were able to change dramatically with their cannabis policy in 2016. And we like to believe that Oregon sort of paved the way for that in a non-presidential election year in 2014. So it was during that time that I founded the group Moms for Yes on Measure 91 and did a lot of advocacy and public speaking and served as a spokesperson for the Measure 91 campaign. Because I stand firm in my belief, and through the mobilization of parents, it became very obvious that this was a pivotal demographic to be hitting. And I very much believe that once cannabis is normalized for mothers and once it's accepted by mothers, that it will be accepted by the rest of society. I very much believe that because mothers are such a driver when it comes to policy change around things like substances. We've seen it, time and time again in the history of this country with other topics. So after the measure passed, then I also still served as a spokesperson and helped with the rollout of the measure. And really, it was around that time that I started to become very well networked with this like amazing group of people and women especially that were just kind of like really ready to like jump into the industry. And that's when Women Grow was very new on the scene as well. And so I helped found the Portland Women Grow chapter alongside two other women here. And we became very quickly the largest chapter, the fastest growing chapter. We were having massive events every month and helping people network in this brand new industry here. And especially women, and being able to allow women to network with each other and build relationships like women already do so well with each other, but with this like very clear goal in mind of entrepreneurship and change. So it was a very special thing to be a part of here during that time in 2014, mostly 2015, 2016 here in Oregon. And it was during that time that I was running the Women Grow chapter that I actually got approached by a publication called Dope Magazine, which you might remember. They are no longer in existence, but they were running hard there for several years and did a whole lot for the emerging industry in many states. And they asked me to start writing for them. And my degree is actually in education, so I don't have a journalism background. I did have a lot of experience in writing. And so I was kind of like, sure, I'll try it out. And they were just like, you're great. So they just kept giving me stories and kept giving me stories. And then I got approached by Leafly to do some writing for them. I got approached by, MG Retailer to do some writing for them back then. And it was in 2014 or 15, I think, when I became one of the owners, or I came involved with the Weed blog. And then it was in 2016 when my partner Travis and I became the sole owners of the website. So I've managed content and the editorial situation for the most part at the Weed blog ever since that time. And at that point,
Travis also have like a background in journalism or anything? He just has that same passion as you to.
No, we both come at and I would say this for any hat I wear in the industry, that I come at it very, very much as an activist. I can tie anything I do in this industry back to activism, back to pushing the big wheel forward about, ending prohibition, about normalization, about social justice and economic equity and social equity, environmental equity, all of those things. So his background, he manages more of the operational stuff and some of the other business relationships and some of that stuff. Whereas I was really like the one that was doing the content and managing that and doing the interviewing and those kinds of things. So moving through that, and then I had even more opportunities open up for me for freelance journalism in the cannabis sector specifically. And I even had really small, like local publications here in Oregon approach me to write for them that were not cannabis specific like publications, but that were like, we want a cannabis specific piece. Like I had a real estate publication here asked me to write a home growing piece because this was right after legalization had happened. And they were like, we want our homeowners and people looking for homes to know what's okay and what's not. So things like that were starting to happen for me more and more. So currently I still manage the editorial logistics of the website for theweedblog.com. I write a column that's called Ask Leah in a Missouri publication that's just strictly print right now called The Evolution Magazine. I've been with them for about 4 years, and I write very specific sort of 101 patient and consumer questions for them. And it was the publisher's idea to call it Ask Leah, not mine. So, but that's been a really cool thing to do because I feel like I'm also serving consumers and medical marijuana patients that are either brand new or brand new after a long time or are trying to educate their relatives or friends. So I've been doing that for about 4 years. I'm also involved with a publication called Sweet Jane that is pretty specific for women and mothers who are curious about cannabis or work in the cannabis industry, and have, just had kind of a list of different publications I've written from between now and then. But being a journalist in this industry, especially operating as a journalist since 2016, basically in this industry, has given me like a very unique vantage point of really gathering a lot of information from a lot of different people and about a lot of different things in this industry, and being able to kind of watch it sort of from a journalist standpoint, where I am fairly ancillary. I'm not touching the plant like people such as yourself, but getting to talk to them ongoing and hear about the challenges they're having, to hear about, what is the most difficult for them and what are they finding success and how are they being received by their consumer base or by their community, has been really a very, very fascinating thing to be able to do.
And so
One of
learning all that and being an activist for so long, how do you think that legalization has really impacted society?
I think there's so many ways. One of the, and I'll talk about like a couple of other different ways, but like one of the series that I wrote was, I wrote it sort of as the beginning of the pandemic was happening, and we were having, especially here in Portland, we were having a lot of protests and marches, revolving around the murder of George Floyd and everything that sort of spilled out after that. And I'd been wanting to write a very specific piece about social justice and the drug war for a long time. So I do have a 4-piece series that's published on the Weblog that touches on as many of those aspects of the drug war that that I found to be like, one's all about prison reform, one is all about the sort of racial discrimination and criminalization of cannabis, one's about prohibition, one's about the disproportionate incarceration rates and arrest rates. So there's a lot to be said there. But as far as like impact on society, I think, one thing I think we can always talk about is the economic impact it's had on society. This, beginning of legalization has literally birthed this like newly legalized industry that just has all kinds of capabilities for changing things. And one of the biggest being the cannabis tax revenue. And what can we do with that to make meaningful change besides just, funnel it straight into a general fund? I very staunchly believe that cannabis tax revenue should be used in an attempt to reinvest and repair the harms of the drug war in those communities that have been impacted the most. So I think the economic impact is something that none of us can deny, even across the country, even in states that are still vastly like prohibition in their legislation, there are people that are operating in some way in the industry, which is always interesting to me to talk to those people, But I think the economic impact is one. I think two, one of the biggest ways it's impacted society is the manner in which, and not everyone is thinking this way, but I do think there's a paradigm shift happening about people thinking about plant medicine in general and how to utilize that in a way that we would have traditionally only thought about using pharmaceuticals or very traditional Western medicine techniques. Because the research that is coming out, while it's still a Schedule 1 substance and it is still not allowed for FDA research, there's been tons of private research and tons of research done in universities and other very well-established platforms like that have shown the medical benefits of cannabis that no one can deny. I mean, you have CNN talking about it, you have CBS and all these other major news platforms talking about the medicinal benefits and the therapeutic benefits of cannabis. So I think that's been another huge impact of society, that it's giving the citizen and the consumer an option for something besides pharmaceuticals, where it doesn't have as strong of side effects, where it doesn't have the same amount.
And alcohol as well.
And alcohol, absolutely. Like giving people an alternative to alcohol who just don't do well with it, but would like something to relax or something to take the edge off or to be in that sort of social mindset. I think that is another big thing, from the consumer in that way. But that's been one of the biggest, two of the biggest I think of when I think of how it's impacted society. And just in general, giving people another way to consider how to, base the way that they live their lives, the way that they choose to parent, the way they choose to educate their children, everything like that. I know that you and I think a lot of the same things when it comes to stuff like that. And I appreciate
communicate. Yeah, you got to communicate with your children. You got to talk about it. You can't just hide it and push it away,
Yeah,
like some people want to do. It's the only way that they're going to also understand as they grow and as this industry continues to grow and the stigma starts to go away. Like they need to understand now, and we don't need to continue to live in the past of like hiding it. And it's this war on drug kind of
Right.
mentality that we grew up with, you
Right. And
know?
what I say to people often is like, do you have a wine rack in your home? Do you have a liquor cabinet in your home? Like, and so many people do, and it's a very normalized thing. Or they have the beer
Hmm.
fridge in the
Right.
garage or the basement or something like that's all very, very normalized. So, and, assuming that parents are approaching alcohol education responsibly, there's no reason, unless I want to acknowledge, like, there are people living prohibition states, there are people that, like, their livelihood would be very much threatened depending on how they choose to discuss cannabis in their household, so I do want to acknowledge that. But like people like myself and yourself who live in states where we have legalizations, where we are able to like have that voice and we are able to be a part of educating future generations about that, I think it's a very important responsibility that we have in terms of like being parents, and also teaching our kids to like making change is important when you believe in it, and these are the
Yeah.
reasons why I choose to work in this industry, or I choose that these are my values.
But luckily, every year we're getting a new state online, either for medicinal purposes or recreational. So it's really exciting that I feel like we're getting closer. And then fingers crossed we get rescheduled or descheduled would be ultimate, but this
Yes.
year. But we'll see what happens.
Yes.
So, what is the most important message you want to convey through your writing and your ultimate goal with the Wheat Blog?
Yeah, thank you. The Weed Blog has always been and will always continue to be a very advocacy centric cannabis website. And I don't
So
want to.
more political.
Yes, I'm really involved about, when it comes to political engagement, civic engagement, educating the consumer about everything that has to do with cannabis so that they can form their own decisions about who they want to vote for, about what products they want to choose, about, where they want to shop, about how they want to talk to their children, about how they want to talk to their aging relatives or their friends or their book club or whoever. So it's really about putting that knowledge and that power in the hands of the consumer or the patient or the reader, whoever that might be. So that's always been our goal, is to be able to help people to advocate for themselves and to in the bigger picture be able to be a part of the bigger picture of advocacy. That being said, there's all kinds of things you can advocate for in this sector, as you very well know. You can advocate from an industry perspective, you can advocate from a patient perspective, you can advocate from a parent perspective, and there's more and more and more of those, but there's many different hats of advocacy to wear. One of the real tenets of our values and what we try to push out through the Weed Blog is very much grounded in sort of that social justice, economic justice piece that I was talking about earlier, where we just have these communities of people that have just been devastated by the drug war for decades and decades. And whether that was their loved ones being put in prison or being arrested and having other infractions on their records that barred them from employment or housing, certainly barred them from building any kind of generational wealth or home ownership, things like that. Those are all very, very important to me as a cannabis advocate, to continue to advocate that like the cannabis tax revenue and that the movement in terms of advocacy overall really laser like focuses on those things before we think about some of the other things out there, because these are people that still have loved ones that are in prison or are serving that sort of like drug war soldier sentence where they're not in prison, but because of their record, they can't get gainful employment. They can't, all the way down to like, they can't coach their kids' soccer teams, or they can't, volunteer in the school or whatever, because they have a nonviolent cannabis infraction on their record that hasn't been able to be expunged, or they haven't been let out of prison. So, and then you have people, that are right down the street from the prison that are selling cannabis in a dispensary every single day while there's still someone. So I think it's really important that we all consider that there are many, many people out there who have, sort of, had this brunt and this burden to bear for decades and decades, not just themselves, but through their children and their spouses and their, extended families and communities. And those are the people that really need to be recognized and reinvested in first before we think about some other things. So I feel, so a lot of that is like, a lot of the writing that we do on the Weed Blog is in an effort to give that information to people and to also support organizations and platforms that are a part of that same part of the movement.
I really respect and appreciate you and others like you that really put 100% into advocacy for this industry and all the different parts of it, like you mentioned, for the industry, for the patient, for the growers, for the social equity. There are so many different elements to it. And for someone like me that wears a lot of hats in my company, that one of them is that, being on the board of CCIA, I love being part of that, but I can only touch a little bit. I can only support people like you that really 100% can go after it and help so much in this industry. So and my colleagues on the board that I'm with, some of them are just 100%, and they know so much. So I love that I can be a small part of it and support you in this fight for our industry, because we're making history right now, and I'm just so grateful for all the hard work that is done.
Well, thank you. And I would say the same thing to you. And when people you're doing more than what you're being very humble right now. I feel like you're doing more than you think. Because another thing that I always tell people when they're like, well, I don't have time to, do this or whatever. And I'm like, everything matters. If you're just talking to your close friends or your book club or your, the people that you are in your, I don't know, in your parent groups, just talking about it, it's all a part of moving kind of that big wheel forward of education and understanding and political change and reform. So it takes it all, it takes people that are executive directors of nonprofits. It takes, companies that are doing things about it. And it takes, the individual as well. So thank you.
I've learned that, of course. I mean, even, at the small level, even you're talking about community level, your municipality level, the state level, the national level, anything that you can do to really participate is key.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you share a memorable experience that solidified your passion for cannabis advocacy?
Yes, I can, because I have a very, very concrete experience that really fully changed the trajectory of my life. And it took me several years to be able to talk about it without crying, because it was such an emotional experience for me. But I am a St. Louis native. I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. And I went to the University of Missouri-Columbia, and that's where I got my degree in education. And I was a teacher in the public schools there for several years before we started our family. When our children were our two oldest children were 1 and 3 years old, we were growing a small amount of medical cannabis in our basement. And, I won't go into the whole process of how, we were essentially ratted out and how this all happened. But we had a SWAT raid on our home in 2009 in Columbia, Missouri, my husband and I. I was actually in the middle of having a miscarriage that day.
Oh my God.
And so that was the only reason. It was one of those things where it made it a lot harder on me, but because of that, my children weren't there when this happened. And I'm so, so grateful for that, because the PTSD I have from it as an adult, I'm sure would have manifested very differently if they had been there as small children and had to witness what we did. It was about, and this is in 2009 in the middle of Missouri, and things obviously changed since then, but we had a SWAT raid on our home where 3 different law enforcement bodies raided our house. There was a state police group there. There was a local or a state trooper group there. There was municipality police there. And then there was a statewide drug task force that was there. 12 armed men. I'm in the middle of a miscarriage, but they're still holding a gun to my head. They still knocked the door down. Even though we were fully cooperating, we had nothing on our records. We were living in a brand new neighborhood where all the houses kind of looked the same, with brand new sidewalks and everything like that. There was literally they could have knocked on our door and talked to us about it, and everything would have been fine. But that wasn't how they handled it at all. They treated us as if we were harboring terrorists in our house or something like that. So I was not arrested. My partner, Travis, was, and he still is a felon because of this infraction in 2009 today. But that experience and the way that our civil liberties were, really, really, stamped on that day really changed my thinking about a lot. And I will say, just so that when they weighed out all of the cannabis that they found in our basement in the raid, including the stems and the leaves and a part of the root mass and everything, it was about 12 pounds.
Oh
So
my
that's
gosh.
that is what I mean. And so it was probably
Shut up.
that really, if you were just going to cut it down to the flower. So anybody that like consumes or operates in the cannabis industry knows what a small amount that was.
Yes.
And the way we were treated because of it, like I said, it was very violent. It was very, um, anyway, so that happened, and going through the whole legal process of, my partner being arrested because of it, and, having him go through the whole judicial system and through his probation and stuff. And then it really sort of opened my eyes up, that experience, to a lot of things I was sort of blissfully unaware of at that point in my life, like things like civil asset forfeiture, things about, social injustice, things about equity. And just, it really opened my eyes up. Like, that's when I started learning more about the history of prohibition of cannabis in the United States, and like why things were the way they were. There were things I just had never really educated myself on. I knew about the laws, and that was really it. And I really hadn't done a whole lot. So it caused a huge shift in my beliefs. And in less than 3 months after the raid was when we moved out here to Portland, Oregon. And we've been here
That's a
since
big
then, in
change.
2009. And that was really what sort of gave me two huge things as like an advocate. One being, I can't believe people are treated like this every day. And not only are people treated like this every day, but it's done through a very, very racist lens. If we had been living somewhere else, if our skin had been a different color, if we hadn't been able to afford a good lawyer, I'm sure that things would have turned out very, very, very
Yeah.
different for us. We were white and we had a good lawyer. And I believe still to this day, that's why things went the way that they did for us. And that's simply not fair. It's not equitable. It's not ethical. It's not moral, in my opinion, all of those things. And so that was one thing. And that's where the still like the social justice and the economic justice piece comes from, as I was just talking about, is that experience. The other experience that it gave me was I had a really nice little like play group of moms built out for myself, that we would go to the park and the pool and things like that with our kids. All of them turned their back on me. None of them would speak to me after the SWAT raid. None of them. It was like, they were like, well, you did this and now you're a bad person. And in my head, I was like, it really caused me to question my own self, because I was like, am I a bad person? Like, we were growing cannabis and we were literally giving it to AIDS patients and cancer patients and stuff like that. Like, we weren't growing it to do anything else than that with it, really, besides have some for us personally. And
And none of
so,
them had ever experienced cannabis. They hadn't smoked it or enjoyed it themselves
no,
at
they
some
were
point in their life.
really
It
like,
was,
you're evil, you're a bad person, stay away from me. It was and so that was really difficult for me as like a young mother that was, you really depend on that kind of community that you build out for yourself when
absolutely.
your children are younger, as a parent, to like, talk about parenting and to have, social interaction for your kids and stuff. So that was really, 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 really hard for me. And like I said, it took several years for me to even be able to talk about that whole process.
Well, the miscarriage alone, like as a woman that had a miscarriage, like you need that time to mourn. And I'm sure most of our listeners have gone through something like that as
yeah.
well. Like I can't even, it's not even fathomable to me how you would then be rated on a day like that and have to go through all like that. Like that definitely would change your entire life and how
It
you look
was,
at
yeah,
things.
it did. It really, once the dust settled from it, we were kind of like, well, we need to do something about this. Like, this is not okay. And so that's kind of where really, I, I don't, my mother has always been involved in different things. So I think I get this kind of activism slant from her. But like when I was in 5th grade, I was selling stationery and trail mix to save the rainforests in Brazil.
Oh yeah, you've always
Fast,
had
I was doing other
it.
advocacy for things like, even women's reproductive rights when I was in high school. And then I became a teacher and was doing tons of advocacy for education reform. So it was kind of like already in me. And so that experience sort of like really funneled that like advocacy all into the cannabis sector for me. And I think, founding the group called Moms for Yes on Measure 91 in 2014, I think one of the reasons that it was so it wasn't easy, but why it was less difficult for me to like put my face out there onto the campaign was because of that experience I had with those moms after the SWAT raid. Because I was like, well, I've already had, people turn their back on me because of this, and it hurt really, really bad. So if people are going to do that, I guess I'd rather know now,
But
than if something else.
what a transformation to go from a community like that completely shuns you to a new community of women that support you and believe in the same thing. Like to find that is, is
It,
incredible.
it meant everything. It really
Yeah.
meant everything, because I didn't even, because I was wearing my Yes on Measure 91 t-shirt to the PTA meetings. I was watching it whenever I was, you know, driving carpool. Like I was wearing it out and proud. And I do live in Portland, and I call it the Portland bubble sometimes because we are a very liberal city here. But I had parents ask me questions that were thoughtful. I did not have anyone, naysay or hate on me, at least to my face. There was stuff happening on the internet, but like that was a lot more manageable than what I had gone through before. So having that community definitely meant everything to me at that time. And, Earl Blumenauer, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has been a congressman here in Oregon forever. Very, very huge advocate of the industry and of reform. So grateful to have him here in Oregon and grateful to have him still active on the Capitol. But he came up to me at the Measure 91 like victory party in 2014 and said, I really think that the Moms for Yes on Measure 91 campaign was a huge part in this campaign. Thank you so much for your advocacy. And so to have that kind of recognition, even though it was just word of mouth and it was like, wow, like that. And so that motivated me to continue on this advocacy path. It wasn't just like, okay, well, now I'm done. It was like, well, no, actually, and then I've found, since then, like, well, when you get something passed, it's not actually like done. Then you have all these other things you have to continue to advocate for. And of course, there's other states and there's things to advocate for on the national level and the global level as well. So. But that is definitely the concrete experience that solidified my involvement in this industry, probably till I die. So
I love the journey. I hate how it started and what it, but I love where it's gotten you to and how much work you put into this, because you are one of those people that are changing history for us, and which is just really spectacular. And so I do know, being in this industry, that it is very hard and very challenging, but I remind myself every day that no matter how hard it is, we are making a difference, and in the long run, this is going to be well worth it.
Yeah.
Do you remember your first experience with cannabis?
So again, growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, like my first several experiences with cannabis, whether it was like being around people where I smelled it or knew it was being used, or in the public schools that I was going to, or, just what I was getting by, word of mouth from like, my parents and their friends, or like other people who were older than me that were talking about it, was all very, very much like the just say no, very much like cannabis prohibition, like it's all bad, it's all terrible, don't touch it. I was never given any real education about cannabis. It was just all lumped in with like drugs and other substances as like it's all bad. So I always just thought it was bad. I just, stay away from it. It's bad. There's nothing good about it. It's terrible. I was never educated on the harms of the drug war. I was never educated about the real prohibition of cannabis and how it was used medicinally at some point before it was actually like smashed down. And then we were fed decades of propaganda and conjecture about the plant. So all of my first experiences were just like, stay away from it. If someone's associated with that, they're a bad person, don't do it. And so then, as a young person, when I decided to try it the first time and I was like, well, this isn't so bad, my mind was like, well, then what about all this other stuff that I've been told is like bad, 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 So it was a very interesting thing to have as a young person, because of course, as young people question things anyways, just by natural curiosity. Mm-hmm. And so then I was like, well, if they said this is this bad, then what about this? And what about that? Like what? So it caused me to try to seek out information on my own. And that was very hard to do at that time. And I'm just really grateful now as a mom of, basically 3 teenagers and 2 who I've seen go through the drug education in the public schools now, and 1 who's going through it currently. And again, I live in Portland, so I know it's not like this everywhere, but I'm so grateful to see how much that has changed, how they
Yeah.
do educate about things from substance to substance specifically, and what they acknowledge about things, especially here in Oregon where we have a fully, very robust adult use market and have for several years. It's kind of impossible to tell these young people lies about it
Right.
anymore because
Right.
there's a dispensary every 1,000 feet,
Right.
um, so that was really, and then my first experience with cannabis, and I believe this was when I was in college, when I realized that there were medicinal benefits for it personally, was definitely when I was in college. And then my mother-in-law passed away sadly when my oldest son was only 9 months old, and she died from pancreatic cancer. And she was living with us for the last, like, I guess 7 months of her life, and watching her experience with cannabis and what a drastic difference it made in her as as her quality of life was just kind of deteriorating in general, was like, that really solidified my belief in that plant as medicine, because I had read about it. I'd had a few experiences with myself, especially in terms of like women's reproductive issues and things like that. But watching her and the way it like helped her appetite, helped her mood, helped, everything about her body feel better, I was just kind of amazed. Like, it was really and since then, being a journalist and hearing all these other stories, of people and how it's helped them, or how it's helped them, their children, how they've actually like relocated from one state to another because their children are sick and they want to have access to good, safe cannabis. I all of those things have played a part as I've come along and learned about it more, for sure.
It's such an incredible plant, and it helps so
Amazing.
many people in different ways.
Yeah.
But to see the medicinal side of it is just, it's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're all fighting for. And
Yes.
also it helps relax after a long day, but
yeah.
but
Multi-use, which is one of the best things about it. Yeah.
Right. What advice would you give to individuals looking to enter the cannabis industry?
Yeah, I get this question a lot too, just because I've been operating it so long and like do consulting and stuff like that. And there's a few things, and I feel like number one, do your homework. Do it on everything, like learn about, because of course you're bringing some value to the table. If you're like, I'm an active cannabis consumer and I know all these things about these different products and stuff, that's all very valuable knowledge. But like, do your homework. Do you know the history of cannabis prohibition in the United States? Like, it doesn't take Google it,
Yeah.
Read about that. Read about, like, do you know what terpenes are? Do you know what a terpene profile is? Do you know other things about the science of the cannabis plant? Do you know that the whole sativa indica thing is really kind of a myth, even though like it's still pushed out there? Like, do you know, the different things about the cannabis plant and about, what, curing the cannabis, how important is that? What, storing the cannabis, how important is that? Like things like that. And then obviously like educating yourself on the industry locally, wherever you're trying to procure that job, wherever you're trying to like learn as much as you can about that company or, that city or whatever it is, learn as much about the market there as possible so that you have all those things if you get that interview to be able to pull up. I think that's really important. And then the other thing I would say is like, go network yourself fiercely. Like you can do that, on social media, you can do that through other forums, you can do that through other platforms, go to the local trade organization meeting, buy the ticket, go to it, go to your local, advocacy group meetings. And the more local, the better. The national ones that operate are great, but like the local chapters are always the ones that have the people that are really in that area. So I think doing your homework, making sure that you've researched cannabis in general, and then wherever you're specifically trying to go, and then network yourself and, make sure that if you're coming from somewhere else in the industry, then you have a resume for that. People will often say like, well, I've been doing this for so long, but I really want to work in cannabis, like, well, then think, if you've worked in retail, you bring a skill set into the industry. If you've worked in marketing, you bring a skill set. If you've worked in agriculture, you bring a skill set. Like, think about what you've already done that can, be branched into this position that you're vying for, whatever that might be.
And bring it.
Yeah. And bring your A game.
Yeah. Well, our question of the day is always, how do you elevate daily?
I love that question. Podcast, it's great. Because it's important for all of us to elevate. And in thinking about that, like there's all kinds of things I do, and I am a daily cannabis consumer. But when I think about the term elevate and I think about my life, like the things that I think about, like I'm a daily yoga practitioner. That's a lot for me. Family time is huge to me. I have 3 kids that still live at home. So that's a big way. Like if I am not feeling well or not feeling good, sometimes all it takes is a few squishes for my kids, or something like that. But family and friends, like that's a big way. The social piece is really big for me. Daily walks, daily exercise, movement is a big way that I elevate. I love gardening, and I do generally like plant a few clones in my veggie garden and grow them, but I love to garden vegetables. I love to garden flowers. There's nothing more satisfying to me than to go outside and be able to clip something out of my yard and bring it inside to enjoy, whether that's a tulip or a tomato. Like that is very, very, very satisfying to me. So that's a big thing for me. And then, other things, that are, I'm big on meaningful change. And so I'm involved in a lot of other things outside of the cannabis industry that push through meaningful change in different ways that I won't go into, but that are not specific to cannabis. And so that ongoing, like meaningful advocacy, meaningful civic engagement is a big piece for me as well. But I would say the movement. And then, speaking specifically when we're talking about cannabis and elevating, I'm definitely a flower girl. I would always prefer the cannabis raw flower in a nice clean bong or in a really nicely done pre-roll would always be my favorite. I do enjoy edibles from time to time, ever since the sort of like boom of these other cannabinoids we've seen being put on the market, like CBN, CBG, the other ones that are not as mainstream yet, but with the surge of those coming onto the market, I've done edibles a little bit more, and those have been really helpful for me in my daily practice, whether it's yoga or moving throughout my day, pain management, sleep, things like that. I just have found that those products have really been able to help me balance a really great life. And I love being able to go into the doctor as someone who's middle-aged and say I'm on no medications because I have access to safe cannabis where I live. I appreciate the discussions I'm able to have with people that have been able to wean themselves off of different kinds of pharmaceuticals just with cannabis and lifestyle changes. It's huge.
That's very powerful. I love those stories. They never get old.
That's right. I know. It's amazing.
Where can our listeners find you?
Yeah, thanks. You can find me on LinkedIn. I know that you have there. On Instagram, I'm just Leah Maurer. I'm very active on there. You can always check out theweedblog.com and contact me through there, read my author profile. We do also own a SMS short code 420-420 that we're going to be working with a little bit more. So I'm hoping people will start seeing that. If anyone wants to try it out, you can text You can text VIP to 420-420 if you want to check that out and see how that works and start, mobilizing that way. But yeah, I'm always open to feedback. I'm also Leah Maurer on Facebook. You can message me on there. I'm always happy for feedback and always happy to hear more stories and more story leads from people.
Well, thank you, Leah, so much for coming on today. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me, Autumn, and thank you for all you do. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Inhale, Exhale, Elevate. I am Autumn Shelton. This podcast is an extension of Autumn Brands, which was formed by the passion and knowledge of 2 families that focus on wellness, balance, and a higher self. Our family farm along the coast of Santa Barbara County uses sustainable farming techniques, natural sunlight, and pesticide-free cultivation. You can find our products in dispensaries and delivery services throughout the state of California by going to autumnbrands.com and clicking on Buy Now or looking at our store locator. Follow us on Instagram, autumnbrands_, to learn more.